As we've seen the past few weeks, the Biden administration has been preparing its response to the election variant of COVID. Yes, it's so convenient how COVID just kind of started popping up again now that we're moving into a major election cycle. It's what I call the election variant. They're also reaching for the same tools that they've previously relied on: masking, jabs, social distancing, and censorship.
We are in regular touch with these social media platforms, and those engagements typically happen through members of our senior staff, but also members of our COVID-19 team. Given, as Dr. Murthy conveyed, this is a big issue of misinformation, specifically on the pandemic.
That was former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki back in July of 2021, essentially admitting that the government, the Biden administration, was leaning on social media groups to censor the voices of Americans. Well, thankfully, that is one tool that they will be without this time around. On Friday, the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals said the Biden administration ran afoul of the First Amendment. With me now to talk about this and what it means is Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey, who led the charge against the federal government's First Amendment violations. General Bailey, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So let's get into this. Now, you, along with the Attorney General in Louisiana, Jeff Landry, brought this suit to against the Biden administration. Give us just a little bit of history before we go into the outcome of Friday's opinion.
This is all about protecting our constitutional right to free speech. You know, I believe, like the founders, that the rights codified in the Bill of Rights come from God, not man. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect us from the government. And the purpose of the First Amendment right to free speech is to invite dissent into free, fair, open debate, a marketplace of free ideas where we can disagree with the government. But what President Biden has done is to coerce and collude with big tech social media to silence American voices in violation of the First Amendment right to free speech. The evidence that we've uncovered, 20,000 pages of documents, numerous depositions, led to a preliminary injunction that was obtained on the 4th of July. We've got to build a wall of separation between tech and state. This preliminary injunction is the first brick in that wall laid in celebration of our nation's independence. And so proud of the work that Missouri and Louisiana have done to restore the First Amendment right to free speech in the legacy of freedom that we've enjoyed, that's been passed down by previous generations. The Department of Justice is committed to future violations of our right to free speech. They are dedicated to their vast censorship enterprise. And so they appealed that preliminary injunction granted by the district court. And we were at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where we argued that injunction should stand. Department of Justice disagreed. Luckily, the three-judge panel at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals agreed with our side. And within 10 days, that nationwide injunction will go into place unless the Department of Justice appeals to the United States Supreme Court. We've uncovered the worst First Amendment violations in this nation's history, but we're not going to let Joe Biden destroy free speech in America.
Yeah, I want to go to the next steps here in just a moment to what this court case may lead to, or this decision. But I want to go back. You know, I played that clip of Jen Psaki saying that, the administration was talking to social media platforms. And I remember watching that press conference or that daily press briefing. She talked about Facebook. So we see just a little bit, but that's enough. That was enough to raise, concerns, suspicions for most of us. But because you had a court order, you were able to depose those within the Biden administration and actually find that those types of comments were just the tip of the iceberg. Tell our viewers a little bit about what you found when you were able to depose these individuals in those 20,000 pages of information.
Well, again, we've uncovered a relationship of coercion and collusion. I think Jen Psaki undersells exactly what was going on. It wasn't that they were coordinating or communicating with big tech social media. They were demanding censorship and obtaining that censorship. There were both explicit and implicit threats made to big tech if they didn't acquiesce to the demands of White House officials and to officials at the Department of Justice. This goes beyond just the White House. Now, we do have email traffic from the White House to big tech social media in March, April, and May of 2021. one where Rob Flaherty at the White House Communications Office says the demands are coming from the very top levels of the White House. But we've also got evidence that it's spread across a spectrum of bureaucratic agencies, and the censorship enterprise grew so quickly and so in such scale that the federal government had to design a new bureaucratic apparatus to manage it. And certainly that's what the court found based on the evidence we put on at the trial court and what was affirmed at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. This was a vast censorship enterprise orchestrated by the White House on a magnitude unheard of in America's history. Now think about that for a minute. Go back to 1798 when President John Adams instituted the Alien and Sedition Act to jail and imprison anyone who opposed his foreign policy. And what the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has said is this is worse. And that's why we're going to keep fighting to defend our right to free speech.
So in some cases, based upon the information that you've obtained, would you say that some of the social media platforms were reluctant in taking the actions that they took, and it was done basically at duress because of the threats made by the Biden administration?
Yeah, absolutely. There were both explicit and implicit threats made. We know that the court has identified that there was always a silent or else. Do what the White House says or else. And that the White House and the FBI relied on the inherent authority of their offices and the FBI as a law enforcement agency to achieve this censorship. I would also point out that the court found that big tech changed their terms of service, changed their algorithms at the demand of the White House and the Department of Justice. So this is censorship at its very worst. This is exactly why we have the First Amendment. And, you know, the big tech marketplace acts differently because the Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act has been misinterpreted by the courts to create this oligarchic monopoly that's easier for the federal government to have control over. And that's what makes it so dangerous and pernicious.
All right, so what's next? They have 10 days. This injunction goes in place across the nation unless they appeal to the Supreme Court. What do you think will happen next here?
Well, I think that we're going to the highest court in the land. I mean, I think that's inevitable. Again, these are the worst First Amendment violations in this nation's history. Certainly, that's what the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals found. And so they kind of telegraphed that this would end up at the United States Supreme Court. And I think 50, 100 years from now, people will be reading the case of Missouri v. Biden in a constitutional law textbook and learning about when we restored our right to free speech in this country and protected it from government censorship at Biden's demand.
So let's say this goes to the Supreme Court and they uphold the Fifth Circuit ruling here. Will anyone be held accountable? I mean, this was damaging to the country. People were censored. People lost their jobs. There was so much that happened. Will anybody be held accountable?
Absolutely. We're going to root out this vast censorship enterprise and hold wrongdoers accountable. We now have the power of contempt under the court proceeding to hold wrongdoers accountable. I think Congress needs to look at appointing an inspector general, and we got to keep building that wall of separation between tech and state. But you're absolutely right. Look, the harm wasn't frozen in time. The harm wasn't just a few people who were deplatformed or de-emphasized or whose posts were taken down during COVID. The harm is ongoing, and that's exactly what the Fifth Circuit found. There's a chilling effect on speech where now people are self-censoring. They're afraid to talk about President Trump. They're afraid to talk about election integrity. They're afraid to talk about COVID because they think they'll be removed from these big tech social media platforms because of the censorship that the government did. I would also point out that the First Amendment protects not only the speakers, but the listeners. It's not just the people whose voices were silenced. It's the rest of us that could have used that information to make individualized decisions that were harmed. So the harm was significant. It was it radiated across every user on big tech social media platforms, and it persists today.
So what will be the practical outcome of this? Number one, for free speech, if this, as you said, you feel pretty confident it's going to the Supreme Court, but the evidence seems to be pretty overwhelming that they violated the First Amendment. Let's just say they go with the Fifth Circuit. What will be the practical outcome here going forward?
Well, that we need a permanent nationwide injunction to, again, build the wall of separation between tech and state to prevent the federal government from silencing American voices on big tech social media platforms. And we've only done preliminary discovery to get a preliminary injunction. Like you said, we've only begun to scratch the surface. We've got to continue to root out this vast censorship enterprise and put a stop to it. And the time is of the essence. I mean, the clock is running here because we're moving into an election cycle. And in court on May 26th, when the Department of Justice, Biden's attorneys were asked by the judge whether or not it would be a violation of the First Amendment for the Department of Justice to censor an American citizen questioning the integrity of an election, the Department of Justice was non-committal. They are dedicated to future violations of the First Amendment. So that wall of separation between tech and state is vital now more than ever. COVID was the Trojan horse that got the enemy behind the wall.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because there's so much more going on here. So, General Bailey, let's say this injunction is in place and you have more violations in the future. Who can take action then to hold the government accountable to the provisions of the injunction?
Well, we'll go to court and hold individuals accountable and ask that they be held in contempt and jailed if necessary. I mean, that's absolutely critical. But I would also point out that Congress has a role to play here. You know, there have been congressional hearings on the weaponization of government and on the government's response to COVID that have both made the same findings that the court has made in our lawsuit. So that's two branches of government finding that the executive branch has violated the First Amendment. And so I think Congress's role is to appoint an inspector general to monitor compliance with the court order and to ensure that federal officials in the executive branch aren't violating our First Amendment rights. And that's the best remedy they can provide. Mine's the lawsuit and the power of contempt as provided by the courts.
I mean, this is as you say, this is a really big deal, because if we don't have free speech in this country, or we have it, but we're afraid to use it because we might lose it, then we don't have it. We have to be free to speak our minds, even if it runs counter to the the predominant thinking of Washington, D.C. It's critical.
Well, and that's exactly the problem with the censorship campaign orchestrated by the federal government under Biden's demand. They targeted one viewpoint. This wasn't targeting misinformation. Every piece of information that they censored ended up being truthful, and it was entirely stilted towards conservatives. They only silenced voices in opposition. That is a clear betrayal of our trust and values and a violation of the First Amendment right to free speech.
Would individuals, once this is fully adjudicated and it's proven that they did violate First Amendment rights, and if there's evidence out there for particular individuals, will they be able to take private action against government officials?
I think so. And at the end of the day, I would submit that we have proven it. I mean, again, we went to court on May 26 and had to put on evidence to justify the nationwide injunction, the preliminary injunction. The court believed the evidence, issued that injunction, and it's now been reviewed and affirmed by the Court of Appeals. So we've proven that we're likely to succeed on the merits, and we can establish that there's been individuals who have been harmed. Again, the magnitude of the harm radiates across every single user of big tech social media, not just those that were individually censored, but those that were deprived of necessary information.
That sounds like a class action suit to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, we're proud in the state of Missouri to have partnered with like-minded Attorney General Jeff Landry in Louisiana and private plaintiffs as well. But I think that we've only begun to scratch the surface. And as we get more evidence, I think that the magnitude of the violations, Biden's violations of the First Amendment, will only become more clear and more apparent.
Well, thank you for fighting that fight. And General Bailey, you're actually going to be with us this coming weekend at the Pray Vote Stand Summit, talking about something else you've been working on there in the state of Missouri. Give our viewers and listeners just a taste of what you're going to be talking about.
Well, so humbled at the opportunity to attend the event and to speak. At the end of the day, I want Missouri to be the safest state in the nation for children. And here in Missouri, we've taken a firm stand against gender mutilation, against child sterilization in the name of transgenderism. And so proud of the work that we've done, both investigating these pediatric clinics, putting a stop to it, and supporting our legislative efforts to ban it in statute. And we're the first state in the nation to have successfully defended a state statute prohibiting these kinds of procedures at the trial court level. So proud of the work we've done to make Missouri the safest state in the nation for children.
Well, and you've done an outstanding job on that front as well. And we look forward to having you as a part of this year's Pray Vote Stand Summit. So I'll see you this coming weekend. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Looking forward to seeing you soon.